I wasn't supposed to be there. That's the thing nobody tells you when you look back at the moments that change you. You're never supposed to be there. You stumble in. You almost miss your train. You take a wrong turn off the tube because the central line was delayed again and, you figured, what the hell, I'll just walk. And then, suddenly, you're standing on the mall, and the world is doing something enormous right in front of your face, and all you can do is stand there with your mouth slightly open and your coffee going cold in your hand. That morning, and I need you to understand how ordinary it started, I had a half-eaten piece of toast on my kitchen counter in Kensington. My daughter had left her school bag by the front door again. The boiler made that noise it always makes. Everything was exactly as it always was. And then, I stepped outside and felt it. You know how some days just feel different? The air sits differently. Sounds carry further. People on the pavement walk with their chins up instead of looking at their phones. It's like the city itself is holding its breath and, you don't know why yet, but your body knows before your brain catches up. I pulled out my earphones. Tucked them in my pocket. And I started walking toward whatever it was. It was the 14th of April when London became something else entirely. Not the London of red buses and queuing and tooting at pigeons. Something older than that. Something that had been sleeping under the cobblestones for years, waiting for the right moment to surface again. The city remembered, I think. Cities do that. They remember coronations and funerals and the footsteps of kings, even when the people walking on top of them have forgotten. The preparations had been building for weeks, of course. You'd have to have been living under a stone not to notice. Every shopfront on Oxford Street had something blue and gold in the window. The flower stalls near Embankment had been selling white roses faster than they could restock them. My neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Margaret, 72 years old, not easily impressed by anything, had bought a Union Jack for her balcony for the first time in her life. When I asked her about it, she just shrugged and said, "It feels right this time." That's what people kept saying. It feels right this time. The transition had come quietly, as these things do in England. There had been the official announcements, the weeks of ceremonial preparation, the careful choreography of an institution that has had centuries to perfect the art of change without appearing to change at all. The palace had released a brief, elegant statement. Parliament had met. The Archbishop of Canterbury had spoken. And, now, on this grey-bright April morning, the formal public debut was about to happen, the moment when William and Catherine would step forward not as prince and princess, not as future something, but as king and queen. Actually king and queen. I still couldn't quite fit those words around them, if I'm honest. Not because they weren't deserving, God, no. Anyone who'd watched Catherine over the years, watched the way she'd grown from a girl who looked slightly terrified at garden parties into a woman who could silence a room simply by entering it. Anyone who'd seen the transformation knew she was ready. And William. William had been carrying this his whole life, this invisible weight, this enormous thing sitting just over his left shoulder since the day he was born. But, knowing something is coming and actually seeing it arrive are two entirely different experiences. I rounded the corner near St. James's Park and stopped walking. The crowd was, there is no other word for it, oceanic. I have been to Wimbledon on finals day. I have stood in Trafalgar Square on New Year's Eve when the fireworks went off and 40,000 people all gasped at the same time. I thought I knew what crowds looked like. I did not know what crowds looked like. The mall stretched out before me like a river that had somehow become made of people. As far back as I could see past the Canada gates, past the trees, right back to Trafalgar Square itself, there was just humanity. Packed together, shoulder to shoulder, and yet somehow it didn't feel chaotic. It felt purposeful. Everyone facing the same direction. Everyone waiting for the same thing. There were the tourists, obviously. You could spot them by the professional cameras around their necks and the slightly glazed expressions of people who had been standing since 4 in the morning. A Japanese couple near me had matching Union Jack hats and were consulting a laminated guide sheet with tremendous seriousness. A group of Americans were arguing cheerfully about which window to photograph. A tall German man directly behind me had a selfie stick extended to its absolute maximum height and was narrating quietly into his phone in what sounded like very calm, methodical German. But, then, there were the others. The ones who'd grown up watching this family. The woman in her 60s with the small handmade sign that said William and Catherine are King and Queen, the letters slightly uneven, like she'd made it the night before at the kitchen table. The elderly gentleman in a blazer and a poppy pin, standing very straight, very still, like he was at a ceremony he'd been training for his whole life. A young mother with a baby on her hip, the baby entirely unbothered, chewing on a teether, and the mother's eyes already glassy, not even trying to hold back whatever she was feeling. I took a spot near the iron railing, about 6 people deep from the front. Close enough. Around me, people spoke in low voices, the way you do in churches or waiting rooms, not because anyone told you to, but because the occasion demands it. Someone passed a flask of tea along the row. Someone's phone played a clip of the national anthem and they fumbled to silence it, embarrassed, and the people nearest to them laughed softly, and, for a moment we were all just people together, strangers who'd ended up at the same place on the same extraordinary morning. The sky above the mall was doing something wonderful. It had started the day overcast, that flat English gray that promises nothing, but around 9:30 the clouds began to thin, and, by the time I arrived, the sun was making its way through in long pale columns, the kind that look almost staged, almost too cinematic to be real. Someone near me said, "Even the weather's cooperating," and there was a murmur of agreement that rippled outward through the crowd. I looked up at Buckingham Palace at the end of the long straight road. The gates were still closed. The guards stood in their positions, those famous figures in their red tunics and bearskin hats, absolutely motionless. I'd seen them dozens of times over the years, and I'd watched tourists try every trick imaginable to get a reaction, stepping too close, saying absurd things, waving directly in their faces. The guards never moved. They were trained to be statues, trained to stand outside of the moment the way the palace itself stood outside of ordinary life. But even they looked different today. I couldn't explain it. Nothing about their posture had changed. Their faces were as blank and composed as ever. And yet there was something in the way they held themselves, something that felt less like performance and more like genuine pride. Like they were standing guard not just because it was their job, but because on this particular morning, they actually wanted to be here. I think a lot of people felt that way. The sounds of the crowd changed about 40 minutes before it happened. There's a specific frequency that a large group of people makes when they shift from waiting to anticipating. It's not louder exactly, it's denser. Like the air gets heavier. Conversations drop off. Phones go down. People stop taking photos of the scenery and start watching the gates. A child somewhere behind me said, loudly and clearly, "Is it happening?" And their parent whispered back, "Almost, sweetheart." Almost. I felt my own chest tighten a little. Which surprised me, if I'm honest. I'm not particularly sentimental about these things. I hadn't planned any of this, hadn't set an alarm, hadn't brought a flag, hadn't coordinated with anyone. I was just a person who'd gone for a walk. But, standing there in that crowd, with the sun coming properly through the clouds now and the guards standing their solemn watch and all those thousands of people breathing together, I felt something that I can only describe as the weight of time. You think about everyone who'd stood in this exact spot before you. Every generation that had watched something enormous happen on this same stretch of road. The city just keeps accumulating these moments, layer upon layer, and every now and then, you get to be part of a new layer and you realize that's not a small thing. That's actually everything. A ripple moved through the crowd, starting somewhere to my left and traveling fast, the way electricity travels. People were rising onto their toes. The Japanese couple abandoned their laminated guide sheet. The German man with the selfie stick repositioned dramatically. The elderly gentleman in the blazer stood even straighter than before, which I hadn't thought possible. The gates were beginning to move. Someone near the front let out a sound, not quite a gasp, not quite a word, and it spread backward through the crowd like a wave, and suddenly, 10,000 people were as quiet as I had ever heard 10,000 people be. The gates opened. And the world leaned forward. I want to try to describe what it looked like when they appeared. I want to do it justice, because I think that's important. I think when something genuinely historic happens, someone ought to try very hard to find the right words for it, even if the words don't quite fit. They came slowly. Deliberately. The way you walk when you know the moment belongs to everyone. William was in his naval uniform, dark, immaculate, the kind of thing that makes a man look like he was born to wear it, which he was. But it wasn't the uniform that you noticed first. It was his face. I'd seen William's face my whole life on magazine covers, on news broadcasts, in blurry photographs from polo matches and charity events. I thought I knew his face. But this was a version of it I'd never seen before. Composed, yes. Prepared, yes. But there was something else underneath all of that, something quiet and almost private, like a feeling he was keeping carefully contained because he knew that right now the feeling belonged to the occasion, not to him. He was king. And he knew it. You could see that he knew it. And then, Catherine. Oh, Catherine. She was in ivory and silver, the details don't matter, the dress doesn't matter, except that it was exactly right in some way that I couldn't have predicted. She wasn't dressed for a wedding or a garden party or any of the things she'd worn before. She was dressed for a crown. Not literally, the formal ceremonial pieces would come later, but in the way she carried herself, in the set of her shoulders, in the way she looked out at the crowd. She looked at us. I mean, she actually looked at us. Not past us, not over us, not through us. She looked at the crowd the way you look at something you love. She'd been through so much, we all knew that, though the full weight of it was hers alone to carry, and it was all somehow present in her face without her face showing any of it. It was the most extraordinary composure I've ever seen on a human being. Not distance. Not armor. Just depth. The roar started somewhere near the front. It didn't build gradually. It just arrived, like something that had been waiting for permission and, finally, got it. 1,000 voices and, then, 10,000 and, then, what felt like every set of lungs on the mall all doing the same thing at the same time. Not words, not yet. Just sound. Joy in its purest form. The baby on the hip of the woman next to me startled and, then, laughed, delighted by the noise. The elderly gentleman in the blazer, I watched his face very carefully in that moment, I don't know why, but I did. It pressed his lips together and blinked 3 or 4 times rapidly, and then composed himself back into stillness. The woman with the handmade sign raised it above her head. I don't know when I started clapping. I don't remember deciding to. My hands were just doing it. William raised a hand in acknowledgement, a steady, unhurried gesture, King's greeting, and the roar went up another register. Catherine beside him lifted her hand too, and there was something so familiar about that gesture, so warm, so human, that the roar shifted into something more emotional than celebration. It became recognition. It became, we see you. We've been watching you your whole life and, we see you, and, today of all days we see you. I realized my cheeks were wet. I hadn't noticed myself crying. I wasn't even sure why, exactly. Grief isn't quite the right word, because this wasn't sad, not entirely. It was the feeling you get when something that was supposed to happen finally happens, and you understand in that moment just how long you've been waiting for it, even if you never consciously knew you were waiting. The crowd pulsed forward slightly, everyone unconsciously leaning toward the thing they'd come to see, and the guard stepped in, and nobody pushed, nobody shoved, because that's not what today was. Today was the kind of day that makes people better than they usually are. The King and Queen of England stood in the morning light. And the world, very simply, watched. His name was Corporal James Ellery, and he had been standing in the same position for 3 hours and 47 minutes when it happened. He didn't know that we would find out his name later. He didn't know that by the following morning, every newspaper from London to Lagos would have his photograph on the front page, that face, that moment, frozen in time the way certain moments get frozen. He certainly didn't know that a woman standing 6 rows deep in the crowd on the mall, holding cold coffee and blinking back tears she hadn't expected, would end up writing about him 3 months later. Nobody knows these things when they're living inside them. That's the strange mercy of it. I should explain what I saw, and try to explain it in the right order, because the order matters. When William and Catherine first appeared at the gates, the crowd's attention was obviously, completely, understandably, on them. On the King and Queen. On the weight of the moment, the history of it, the love and grief and pride all tangled up together in the sound that was coming out of 10,000 people simultaneously. Everyone was looking at the same thing. Except I wasn't. I'm not sure why. Some instinct, maybe the same one that makes you look at the edges of a painting rather than the center, the thing you notice in the corner of a photograph that everyone else has walked past. My eyes drifted right toward the line of guards stationed along the approach, and that's when I saw Corporal Ellery. He was doing his job. Which means he wasn't doing what the crowd was doing. He wasn't watching the king and queen with the rest of us, he was watching the crowd, watching the perimeter, watching the shifting movement of 10,000 people the way a sailor watches the sea. His face was regulation blank, his posture was perfect, his bearskin hat was exactly level. Everything about him was exactly as it should be. Except his eyes. Here is the thing about the guards that most people miss, because most people are looking at their stillness and not at them specifically, they are human beings. They are people wearing very elaborate professional armor, and underneath the armor there are feelings and thoughts and instincts. The training is extraordinary, decades of practice going into that absolute stillness, that famous total composure. But training doesn't remove the person. It just puts a very polished surface over them. And, on this day, at this moment, something in Corporal Ellery's eyes was different. He was watching the crowd. But he was also, and I would swear to this, feeling it. I could see it in the very small, very controlled tightening around his eyes. Not emotion breaking through, not anything close to a crack in his composure. More like recognition. Like a man who has dedicated his professional life to protecting something, finally seeing, in the clearest possible way, why that thing is worth protecting. I watched him for longer than I should have, probably. And then, the thing happened. It started with movement. The crowd had surged forward slightly in the wake of the king and queen's appearance, natural, organic, the kind of thing that happens in any large gathering when the focal point shifts. The guards along the approach were managing it with the practiced invisibility that's part of their art, gentle corrections, redirections, nothing alarming. But, about 30 meters to my left, a gap had opened in the barrier. It was small, the width of a person, no more, and it happened fast, the way these things do, one barrier section losing its anchor and being pushed gradually sideways by the pressure of the crowd. Most people didn't notice it. Most people were still watching the royal couple, hands raised, cameras up, some still crying, all of them forward-facing and entirely absorbed. But 3 people noticed. A young man, maybe 20, maybe 22, wearing a bright orange backpack and the slightly manic energy of someone who has decided to do something impulsive, saw the gap and moved. Not aggressively. Not violently. He moved the way people move when they've had one idea and have committed to it before thinking it through, fast, without hesitation, with just enough forward lean to be unmistakable. And Corporal James Ellery, from 15 meters away, facing the wrong direction, in the middle of managing 3 other things, saw him. I don't know how. I genuinely cannot explain the mechanics of what I witnessed. One moment Ellery was still, regulation still, eyes moving in their careful pattern across the crowd. The next moment he was moving. Not running, you won't ever see a King's Guard run in a panicked way, that's another layer of the training, but moving with a speed and purpose that was so absolutely controlled it was more alarming than running would have been. Like watching a car shift from stationary to 60 without any of the intermediate stages. He reached the gap in the barrier just as the young man with the orange backpack was stepping through it. What happened next lasted maybe 4 seconds. I've replayed it many times in my memory, trying to get the sequence exactly right, trying to be a reliable witness to the thing I saw. Ellery stepped into the gap. He didn't grab. He didn't shout. He positioned himself 6 feet of trained British military bearing directly in the young man's path, and he said something. I was too far away to hear it over the crowd noise, but I could see his lips move, and whatever he said was brief and completely calm, and the young man in the orange backpack stopped. Just stopped. The way you stop when you've run into something that makes you suddenly and completely aware that you have miscalculated. Not afraid, the young man didn't look afraid. He looked like someone who had been reminded of something. like a person who'd gotten so caught up in the moment that they'd briefly forgotten where they were and what this was, and Ellery had, in 4 words or fewer, reminded them. The young man took a step back. Ellery held eye contact for a moment, steady, unhurried, absolutely professional, and then moved to close the barrier gap, and another guard appeared from nowhere to anchor it, and the whole thing was over. 20 seconds, start to finish. No one in the immediate area seemed to register it as anything unusual. The crowd was still cheering. The king and queen were still moving forward. The music from the military band somewhere behind the palace gates was still playing. But I had seen it. And I noticed something. This is the part that has stayed with me, that I keep coming back to after Ellery closed the gap and repositioned himself and the situation was completely resolved. He went back to standing. Not slumping back into standing. Not visibly exhaling. Not checking his watch or scanning for acknowledgement or doing any of the things a human being usually does after handling something that required fast thinking and faster action. He just went back to standing. Eyes moving in their pattern. Face composed. As if it hadn't happened at all. Except his chin was slightly higher. I'm not sure he was even aware of it. It wasn't a proud gesture, nothing theatrical. It was just fractionally higher. The way a person's posture shifts when something has confirmed, quietly, privately, something they already knew about themselves. I thought, that is what duty looks like when nobody is watching. And then, I thought, someone is always watching. The procession had moved further along the mall by now, and the crowd was moving with it the way a tide moves, not a rush, just a continuous, gentle forward pressure. I let myself be carried a little, stepping sideways to maintain my position near the railing, keeping sight of the royal couple while also keeping Ellery in my peripheral vision. He had gone back to being a statue. But the woman next to me, the one with the baby on her hip, had seen it too. I knew because she turned to me about 30 seconds after it was over and said, very quietly, "Did you see that?" "I did," I said. She shook her head. Not in disbelief. In the particular way you shake your head when something has given you a feeling you don't quite have words for yet. "He didn't even blink," she said. "No," I agreed. "He didn't." The baby grabbed a fistful of her hair and she winced and laughed and the conversation ended there, the way conversations in crowds usually end, but the feeling it named stayed with me. There is something about witnessing that kind of competence, quiet, invisible, unacknowledged, that does something to your understanding of the world. It recalibrates things. It reminds you that behind every enormous public moment, there are dozens of people doing their jobs so well that the moment gets to happen at all. We never know most of their names. I want to stay with William and Catherine for a moment, because I need to describe what happened about halfway along the mall that I think was the most human moment of the morning, and possibly the most important. They had paused. This wasn't part of the program. Anyone who'd read the official schedule, and yes, I'd read it, I'm that person, knew that the procession was meant to be continuous, carefully timed, each moment accounted for. But they'd paused, about midway, and William had leaned slightly toward Catherine and said something, and she'd looked up at him, not at the crowd, not at the cameras, at him, and smiled. Not the public smile. Not the one that's practiced and ready and appropriate for photographs. The other one. The one that starts in the eyes before it reaches the mouth, the one that's involuntary, the one that happens when someone says something that only makes sense between the two of you. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then, they both looked back at the crowd and continued. But those 2 seconds were transmitted by every camera in the vicinity, and you could feel the crowd react to it, not loudly, not with a surge of cheering, but with something softer. An exhale. An awe that traveled through the crowd like a gentle wave. Because here is what it did, it made them people. Not symbols. Not institution. Not the weight of history or the duty of office or any of the enormous abstract things that this day was also about. Just a man and a woman who'd been through something enormous together and had somehow come through it and were standing here on the other side of it, and for 2 seconds they'd let us see that. I think that's what Catherine has always understood better than almost anyone, that the distance between a monarchy and its people is not maintained by grandeur. It's closed by moments of recognizable humanity. And she has been, throughout her entire public life, a person of recognizable humanity. Even when she was holding it together so tightly you could almost see the effort. Even when the stakes were impossibly high. Even today. Especially today. An older woman in front of me, I hadn't noticed her before, small, white-haired, wearing a silk scarf in the royal blue, let out a long, shaky breath when she saw that smile, and then, she said something I wasn't sure I'd heard correctly at first. She said, "Diana would be so proud." Just like that. Not particularly quietly. And the people immediately around her went very still for a moment, not uncomfortably still, just the still you get when someone has said the exact right thing at exactly the right moment. Nobody replied. Nobody needed to. The military band had shifted to something different. I recognized it a beat after it started, one of the older processional pieces, the kind that seems to exist outside of time, the kind that could be playing in 1953 or 1977 or today and would feel equally suited to all of them. The sound carried across the mall and settled into the crowd, and I felt it in my chest before I consciously heard it with my ears. Sound does that sometimes. Bypasses the analytical part of your brain entirely and goes straight to wherever you keep the things that matter. I looked around me at the people near me. The German man with the selfie stick had completely abandoned any attempt at documentation and was simply watching, his phone hanging at his side. The American group had gone quiet. One of them was holding the hand of another, which they probably hadn't planned to do when they got up that morning in their hotel room. The Japanese couple had put away the laminated guide sheet. Everyone was just watching. Doing the human thing of watching and being present in it. These moments don't come often. You can feel it when they arrive, I think. Something in the atmosphere, something in the way the city itself seems to become more still and more alive at the same time. This was one of those moments. The kind that your children will ask you about later. The kind you'll try to describe and find that language isn't quite enough, and you'll say, well, you had to be there, and you'll mean it in the truest way possible. I'd had to be there. And, somehow, because of a delayed tube and a piece of half-eaten toast and a walk I hadn't planned, I was. Corporal Ellery was still at his post. Still watching. Still unsmiling. Still doing the job that nobody announces and everybody benefits from. I raised my coffee cup slightly in his direction, though he couldn't see me and wouldn't have acknowledged it if he could. It was just something I needed to do. Thank you, I thought. Thank you for standing where you stand. The king and queen turned toward the palace. The crowd roared. And the morning kept going, perfect and improbable and real. The strange thing about the end of a historic moment is that it still ends. You think it won't. You think, surely something like this stays open, stays elevated, continues being extraordinary for longer than a morning. But, then, the gates close. And the guards resume their ordinary rotation. And the crowd, slowly, with a kind of reluctant affection, begins to scatter. And you find yourself standing on the mall with cold coffee and damp eyes and absolutely no idea what to do with yourself now. I stood there for about 10 minutes after. I wasn't ready to go back. Not because I was hoping for something more, the moment was complete, in its way, and I somehow knew that, but because I didn't want to step back into ordinary London and lose whatever this feeling was before I'd properly identified it. So I stood there while the crowd thinned around me, while the family groups gathered their children and their flags and their folding chairs, while the photographers reviewed their shots with the slightly frantic energy of people who know they've captured something but aren't yet sure exactly what. The sun was fully out by now. No more pale columns through cloud. Just clear, uncomplicated April light lying across everything, making the gold of the palace gates look almost impossibly bright. A little girl, maybe 5, maybe 6, was sitting on her father's shoulders directly ahead of me, and she was waving her small Union Jack flag at nothing in particular. The crowd was gone. The royal couple was inside. There was nothing to wave at. But she waved anyway, with the absolute conviction of a child who has decided that waving is the appropriate response and sees no reason to stop simply because the original target of the waving has left. I thought, I want to be more like that. I want to participate in things with that much commitment. Her father caught my eye over the top of her head and we shared a smile, that specific smile between strangers who are both feeling something they couldn't explain to each other if they tried, and then he turned and carried her away through the thinning crowd, the small flag still going. I ended up in a coffee shop on Birdcage Walk. It was warm inside, and slightly foggy with the steam of 100 takeaway cups, and absolutely packed with people who'd come from the same place I had and were now doing what the British do after emotionally significant events, sitting down and talking about it very carefully while pretending they're not emotional about it at all. I got a table near the window by sheer luck. A couple was leaving just as I arrived, the woman still wiping her eyes in that quick, "No, you didn't see that way." I ordered a flat white and a piece of shortbread I didn't need and sat down and tried to organize my thoughts. Across from me, two men in their 50s were deep in conversation. One of them, thick silver hair, a good coat, the particular confidence of someone who has a strong opinion and would very much like to share it, was saying, "It's the continuity, isn't it? That's what it means. It's not about pageantry. The pageantry is just how you make the continuity visible." His companion was nodding slowly, holding his cup with both hands. "She's remarkable, though. Catherine. Always has been, but today she was something different," the silver-haired man agreed. "Today she was it. You know? She wasn't beside it or preparing for it or adjacent to it. She was it. I didn't mean to listen. But, when someone is saying the thing you're trying to think, it's hard not to." The second man, quieter, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, said, "My mother watched the coronation on television in 1953. She was 12. She talked about it her whole life." He paused. "My mother died in February." A silence. "She'd have loved this," he said. The silver-haired man put his hand briefly on his companion's arm, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and it was the quietest, most private grief I'd witnessed all morning, in a room full of strangers, and I had to look out the window because my throat was doing something inconvenient again. My phone had been blowing up for hours. I'd put it on silent somewhere around the moment the gates opened, which I think was the right instinct, but by the time I was sitting in the coffee shop the notification count was frankly alarming. Messages from my sister in Edinburgh. 3 from my friend Priya, who'd watched it on television and was apparently texting live commentary at herself. A voicemail from my mum that I already knew would start with, "Did you watch? Did you watch?" I texted Priya first, "I was there." She replied in 4 seconds, "You were not." I sent her a photo I'd taken, not a good photo, honestly, taken over someone's shoulder with slightly shaky hands, the king and queen blurred with distance, the crowd more in focus than they were. But you could see them. You could see the moment, if not its detail. Priya's reply was a series of emojis that I will not reproduce here but which adequately communicated her feelings. I called my mom. "Were you watching?" she said, immediately, before hello. "I was there, Mom. I was on the mall." A pause. "Oh, love." And then, nothing else for a few seconds, which is how my mother expresses things that are too big for words, always has been. "She looked incredible," I said. "She always does," my mom said, and there was something in her voice that was about more than just today. Something accumulated, all the years of watching this family, this particular woman's journey through the relentless, unforgiving spotlight of being who she is. But today was different. "Yeah," I said. "It was." "And William?" "He looked like a king, Mum." Another pause. "Good," she said. "That's good." We talked for 20 minutes, which is about twice as long as our usual calls, and she told me about watching it on the television with her neighbor Janet, and how Janet had cried from the moment the gates opened to the moment they closed, and how my mum had pretended not to be crying herself, which made me laugh, and it was the most normal conversation in the world and it felt like the exact right way to come down from the extraordinary morning I'd had. Later that afternoon, much later, after I'd walked home through St. James's Park and made lunch and picked up my daughter from my neighbor's house, where she'd been watching coverage with my neighbor Margaret of the Union Jack balcony, I sat with my daughter on the sofa and we watched the replays together. She was 9. Old enough to understand that something significant had happened, young enough to be more interested in the horses and the uniforms than the political and historical weight of the occasion. She kept asking questions. What's that medal for? Why does he walk like that? Did she pick the dress herself? Why are they both waving with the same hand? I answered what I could and said good question to the rest. At one point the cameras caught the moment I'd witnessed, the moment when William had said something to Catherine and she'd smiled the real smile, the one for him. My daughter said, "Oh, they really like each other, don't they?" Not a question. An observation. Yeah, I said. They really do. She thought about this. That's good, she said, in a tone that was oddly identical to my mum's tone from earlier that day, which made me feel something layered and strange and very warm. Because if you have to do a hard job, it helps if you like the person you're doing it with. I looked at her. She was already watching the next clip, completely unbothered, legs folded under her on the sofa. 9 years old, I thought. 9 years old, and she has identified the precise thing that makes this particular king and queen different from the abstract idea of a king and queen. They like each other. They've always liked each other, and you can see it, and that's the thing that makes the institution feel human. Kids cut straight through everything, don't they? That evening I went back out. Not to the mall, that was done, sealed into its moment. But I walked through the neighborhood, just walked, and what I noticed was the small things that the cameras hadn't captured. The handwritten sign in the pub window, "Cheers to the King and Queen, first pint on US." The string of bunting across the alley near the newsagent that someone had clearly put up themselves, slightly lopsided, charming. A group of elderly residents from the estate near the park, sitting on garden chairs on the pavement in the evening cool, still talking, still replaying the day in the comfortable way of people who have the time and inclination to talk something properly through. A man walking his dog stopped next to me at the corner, and we both looked at the bunting, and he said, "Good day, wasn't it?" Not a question. An affirmation. The kind of statement that's actually an invitation. "Really good," I said. He nodded. His dog sat and scratched its ear. "Nice to have something to feel good about," he said. "Just nice to feel good." And then, he walked on, and I stood there a little longer. I've thought about that a lot since. What he said, and the simplicity of it. Nice to feel good. We live in a time when everything is complicated. Everything has a counter-argument and a caveat and a thread under it full of people explaining why the thing you felt was wrong or naive or insufficiently aware of the broader context. And sometimes the broader context matters, and sometimes the feeling is enough. Sometimes standing in a crowd and watching two people step into the largest responsibility of their lives and do it with grace and love and visible humanity, sometimes that's enough to just feel, without needing to immediately qualify the feeling. I felt proud, this strange specific pride you feel for things that aren't yours exactly but that you belong to anyway. I felt hopeful, cautiously, the way English people are always cautiously hopeful, because we've been around long enough to know that nothing is guaranteed, but still hopeful. And I felt something else, something I keep trying to name accurately. Witnessed. That's the closest I can get. I felt witnessed. Like the day had gathered everyone who was there for it and said, "This happened, and you were here for it, and that is not nothing. That will never be nothing." 3 months later, a photograph ran in the evening edition of a London paper. It wasn't the photograph you'd expect, not the iconic one of the king and queen in the gateway, arms raised, the crowd in full roar. That photograph had already won awards by then, already been printed on mugs and magnets and the front pages of 20 countries. This was a different photograph. It had been taken by a photojournalist who'd been embedded with the security detail and had caught a moment from a different angle, a moment most cameras had missed entirely. In it, you could see the royal couple from behind, slightly to the right, their faces in three-quarter profile. And, in the middle ground, in perfect focus, was a figure in a red tunic and bearskin hat, standing at his post. His chin was slightly elevated. The caption read, "Corporal James Ellery, 1st Battalion Grenadier Guards, on duty during the historic debut of King William V and Queen Catherine, April 2026. That was all. But the photograph was something more than a caption. It was the morning distilled. The visible and the invisible together. The people everyone watches and the person nobody noticed, all in the same frame, all part of the same extraordinary thing. I kept the newspaper. I keep it still. Here is what I know, having been there: history doesn't announce itself in advance with fanfare. It doesn't arrive the way you imagined it would when you were reading about it in school or watching documentaries with the reverent narration. It arrives in the middle of an ordinary morning, on a road you've walked 100 times, and it finds you slightly unprepared and a little underdressed and holding coffee that's gone cold. And it asks nothing of you except that you show up. That you pay attention. That you really try to see it clearly and feel it honestly and hold on to whatever it gives you before it moves on and becomes something else. William and Catherine have always understood something about the people who watch them: we don't need them to be untouchable. We don't need the distance of divinity. We need them to be people, real, complicated, imperfect, tried and tested people who have chosen to carry something enormous on behalf of all of us. And, on this April morning, they carried it. Without breaking. Without armor. With a smile shared between two people in the middle of a procession watched by the world, a smile that was just theirs, that nobody staged and nobody planned. That smile is why I think it'll be alright. Not perfect, nothing is perfect, but alright. A king who still has things to say to his queen that make her forget, just for a second, that 10,000 people are watching. A queen who knows how to look at a crowd the way you look at something you love. A guard whose chin is a fraction higher after doing his job well. A little girl waving a flag at nothing, committed to the gesture long after its occasion has passed. And, somewhere in the crowd, a woman who wasn't supposed to be there, who took a wrong turn off the tube and ended up standing on the mall on the morning the world changed slightly, feeling something she can't quite name but has been trying to name ever since. It's something like, we are still here. All of us. Still doing this. Still showing up for each other's moments and standing in each other's crowds and looking up at the same things. Still waving, even after the gates close. That's everything, isn't it? That's actually everything.